My name is Eleanor Vance, and I have always known exactly what a human life costs when it is broken down into cubic feet of prime Virginia timber and the yield of a mid-Atlantic honey harvest. 45 seconds ago, my mother, Vivian, stood on the polished white oak floor of the orchard house, her manicured fingers resting lightly on a glass of chilled Sancerre. She looked at the Kevlar brace stabilizing my left thigh, the permanent souvenir of an insurgent mortar attack outside Erbil, and told me that an estate of this caliber required an heir who could walk the perimeter without a cane. She said my younger brother, Julian, will be taking over the historic family apiary and the surrounding 300 acres of legacy land. She thought she was cutting me out. She thought my discharge papers had stripped me of my teeth. What she didn't know was that while Julian was busy studying the wine list for his next country club luncheon, I spent my rehabilitation leave auditing the ancestral land deeds. Grandpa Silas never left the apiary to the family corporation. He left the legal right-of-way, the agricultural water access, and the proprietary queen bee genetic registry exclusively to me. By tomorrow morning, the Vance Family Holding Company will own nothing but 300 acres of dry, barren soil without a drop of water or a single pollinator to sustain it. I didn't just take back my inheritance. I turned their kingdom into dust while sitting perfectly still. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stopped shrinking to fit a seat they were never offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The Vance estate in the Shenandoah Valley did not smell of flowers, despite the millions of Italian honeybees that pulse through the clover fields every summer. It smelled of cold slate, beeswax polish, and the damp, heavy scent of old money kept behind UV-resistant glass. My grandfather, Silas Vance, built the apiary in the late 1960s, turning a rugged hillside into an elite, high-yield biological enterprise. His honey wasn't sold in grocery stores. It was contract distributed to high-end cosmetic conglomerates and boutique European distributors who paid premium rates for the pure, unadulterated enzyme profile of the Vance lineage bees. But my father and mother never saw the biology. They saw the ledger. My father, Marcus, only spoke to me when the quarterly commodities index adjusted. If the price of agricultural land spiked, he was pleasant at dinner. If the market dipped, the silence in the dining room became so thick you could hear the ice melting in his crystal tumbler. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand how autumn arrived at Blackwood Ridge. The shadows didn't just lengthen. They seemed to settle into the wainscoting of the house like a permanent layer of dust. The estate was a machine, and we were its cogs, measured strictly by our output. My mother, Vivian, was a woman whose elegance was a form of psychological warfare. Her voice was always soft, pitched at a frequency that required you to lean in, forcing you into a posture of submission before she even finished her sentence. She managed the social registry of the valley with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster, ensuring that every dinner party, every charitable gala, and every agricultural alliance served to elevate the Vance name. I was the eldest child, born into a house where affection was treated like a scarce capital resource. While Julian was sent to a private boarding school in Connecticut to learn the art of the golf swing and the correct way to wear a signet ring, I spent my teenage summers in canvas overalls, working the hives alongside Grandpa Silas. Julian was groomed for the microphones and the boardrooms. I was abandoned to the dirt and the sting of the fields. Silas was a man of few words, his hands scarred by decades of stings that he wore like badges of honor. The hive doesn't tolerate parasites, Eleanor, he told me once, his voice a low, gravelly rasp as we puffed sweet pine needle smoke into a brood box. Every bee has a function. The workers don't ask for praise. They ask for structure. If you don't contribute to the collective survival, the guards will drag you to the landing board and drop you into the grass. Remember that when your mother starts talking about legacy, legacy isn't what's written on a stationery pad. It's what's left in the soil when the frost hits. I understood biology, but I also understood logistics. I watched how my father manipulated the corporate bylaws, shifting assets between shell companies to avoid agricultural taxes, always keeping Julian insulated from the actual labor. I realized early on that if I wanted to survive in this family, I needed an objective language. I couldn't fight my mother's subtle scorns with emotion. I needed data. When I turned 18, I didn't ask my parents for European gap year or a sports car. I accepted an ROTC scholarship, earned a degree in agricultural economics and forensic accounting, and commissioned into the United States Army as a logistics officer. I wanted a world where rules were written in federal regulations, not defined by the shifting moods of my mother's cocktail hours. For 12 years, I managed supply chains in hostile environments, handled millions of dollars in theater-level equipment, and kept my head down. I learned how to move thousands of tons of cargo across broken terrain without leaving a trace. I thought that by serving my country and building an impeccable professional resume, I would finally earn the right to look my father in the eye as an equal. Then came the deployment to the Kurdistan region. It wasn't a grand, cinematic battle. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a routine supply audit at a forward operating base, and the sudden, deafening whistle of an incoming 120mm mortar. The blast wave threw me against a steel container, and a fragment of shrapnel tore through the quadriceps tendon of my left leg. The pain wasn't immediate. It was a cold, numbing sensation, followed by the smell of burning canvas and the taste of copper in my mouth. The military medical retirement process is a slow, bureaucratic grinding wheel. As I sat in the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, watching the automated drip of my four, I received exactly 2 letters from home. One was a formal get-well card signed by my mother's secretary, the handwriting a perfect cold script that looked entirely automated. The other was a brief email from my brother Julian, asking if I still intended to use my corporate parking space at the Richmond office during my convalescence, as he wanted to reassign it to a new marketing consultant they had hired from New York. When I finally returned to the Shenandoah Valley estate 2 months ago, limping heavily with a carbon fiber brace beneath my trousers, the house felt colder than I remembered. My father had passed away the previous winter while I was overseas, leaving Vivian and Julian in control of the daily corporate operations. The air in the Grand Library was stagnant, thick with the smell of the imported Cuban cigars Julian had recently taken to smoking to project an aura of executive authority he hadn't yet earned. He looked like a boy wearing his father's oversized suit, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk that he had never wiped down himself. They didn't see a decorated officer returning from combat zone. They didn't see the Bronze Star or the commendations. They saw a liability. They saw a broken tool that no longer fit the pristine, high society aesthetic of the Vance Apiary brand. At the dinner table, my mother's eyes would linger on my cane, her lips tightening into a thin, bloodless line every time the metal tip clicked against the imported travertine tile. "Must you use that particular cane indoors, Eleanor?" she would ask softly, her fingers smoothing her silk napkin. The sound is quite disruptive to the staff's focus. Perhaps a rubber tip would be more appropriate for the domestic environment. I kept my silence. In the military, you learn to observe before you move. You map the terrain. You identify the choke points. You never reveal your line of sight until the target is fixed. While Julian spent his mornings sleeping in and his afternoons on conference calls with luxury real estate developers planning a boutique resort on our eastern ridge, I hobbled down to the old honey house where Grandpa Silas's personal archives were stored. Silas had died 3 years prior, while I was stationed in Germany. My family had told me his will was a standard corporate transition, leaving everything to the family trust. But as a trained forensic auditor, I knew that standard transitions in wealthy families are rarely simple. They usually leave a paper trail of public filings, tax exemptions, and hidden codicils. In Silas's old green metal filing cabinets, beneath 50 years of weather journals, pollen charts, and queen rearing records, I found the original, unrecorded property deed from 1974, along with the foundational charters for the Vance Apiary. What I discovered was a masterclass in rural legal defense. Grandpa Silas had known exactly what my mother and Julian were. He had watched my father turn the honest labor of the apiary into a cold financial instrument. Silas had built a legal labyrinth, and he had handed me the map before he died, tucked inside a leather-bound logbook of the 1998 harvest. The documents were typed on an old IBM Selectric, the ink fading but the legal language razor-sharp. I spent 3 weeks under the soft glow of a desk lamp, cross-referencing state agricultural codes, water rights registries, and corporate asset manifests. I assembled my files with the precise, emotionless discipline of an officer preparing a target packet for a high-value mission. I didn't say a word to Vivian. I didn't say a word to Julian. I ate their silent dinners, accepted their condescending glances, and waited for them to make their move. Tea dismissal was staged with the characteristic, polite cruelty that my mother considered the height of sophistication. It didn't take place in a smoky office or a tense boardroom, but at Vant AI, an exclusive, reservation-only restaurant perched on a ridge overlooking the valley, where the tasting menu cost more than a soldier's monthly housing allowance. The table was set with heavy Belgian linen and sterling silver that caught the low amber light of a late spring sunset. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the valley unfolded like a green velvet ribbon, the very fields of our estate visible in the far distance, glowing under the twilight. My mother sat perfectly erect, her emerald necklace catching the light, while Julian sat opposite her, adjusting his bespoke Italian cuffs and checking his gold watch with practiced, executive impatience. I arrived precisely 3 minutes early. The metal tip of my cane made a sharp, rhythmic sound against the hardwood floor of the restaurant. Click, click, clack. Julian didn't stand to greet me. He merely offered a tight, professional nod and took a sip of his sparkling water. "Eleanor, darling," my mother said, her voice smooth, honeyed, and completely devoid of warmth. "You look tired. The drive from the lower valley must have been taxing on your leg. You really should rest more." "The leg is functional, Mother," I said, placing my cane neatly against the edge of the table and sitting down. I didn't open the menu. I knew we weren't there to discuss the culinary selections. The waiter approached with a bottle of champagne, but Julian dismissed him with a brief wave of his hand. "We'll need a few minutes before ordering. Thank you." He waited until the waiter was out of earshot, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He wore the expression of a senior partner about to terminate an underperforming intern. "Eleanor, we need to talk about the future of the brand," Julian began, his tones smoothly rehearsed, likely practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. "The Vance Apiary is entering a critical restructuring phase. We are finalizing a partnership with a luxury wellness conglomerate based out of Manhattan. It's a multi-million-dollar distribution deal that requires a total modernization of our public profile." "Modernization," I repeated calmly, my voice flat, keeping my hands resting loosely on my lap beneath the table. "Yes," my mother chimed in, her smile never reaching her cold, gray eyes. "The market has changed, Eleanor. A luxury brand requires an image of seamless elegance, vitality, and continuity. We've been reviewing the corporate shares and the management structure that your father left behind in the family trust." She paused, taking a delicate sip of her Sancerre, allowing the silence to hang in the air, a classic psychological tactic designed to make the recipient uncomfortable, to force them to speak and fill the void. I merely watched her, my breathing slow, regular, and deep. My heart rate didn't elevate by a single beat. I had sat in bunkers with mortar shells landing 500 yards away. My mother's dining table tactics were elementary. "We feel," she continued, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, "that the demands of managing an enterprise of this scale are simply incompatible with your current physical limitations and your background. The military is a noble pursuit, of course, but it breeds a certain rigid, unyielding mindset. We need someone agile, someone who can host the Manhattan executives of the country club without awkward explanations. You want me to step down from the board and relinquish my operational oversight, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of their intent. We've already drafted the severance paperwork, Julian said, reaching into his leather briefcase and sliding a sleek, cream-colored envelope across the linen tablecloth. It slid smoothly, stopping exactly 2 inches from my water glass. We're offering you a very generous cash payout, $1 million, structured over 5 years, along with a lifetime use of the small guest cottage on the Northern Ridge. In exchange, you'll sign over your remaining corporate voting shares and formally retire from the family business. It's a clean break, Eleanor. It allows you to focus on your physical therapy without the stress of commercial liabilities. I looked down at the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive cotton rag. The Vance Family Holding Company logo was embossed in silver foil at the top. You're restructuring me out of my own grandfather's company, I said, my voice remaining in that soft, whisper-calm register that I used when briefing general officers on logistics failures. Let's not be dramatic, Eleanor, my mother said, her voice dropping an octave, the polite veneer thinning just enough to show the iron beneath. You were gone for 12 years. You chose the dirt and the noise of the army over this family. Julian stayed. He did the work. He maintained our social position in the valley. Now you return, wounded, dragging a cane, expecting to take the seat your father built? This estate requires an heir who can command a room, not someone who reminds our investors of a VA hospital rehabilitation ward. We are protecting the legacy. Julian nodded, a smug, self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the $1 million was a golden cage I couldn't afford to refuse, given my military pension. I looked at them both. I analyzed the room. The waiter was standing 20 feet away, standard posture, eyes trained on the floor. 2 tech executives were laughing quietly at a table near the window. My mother's hand was steady on her wine glass, but her thumb was nervously tapping the stem, a tell she had had her entire life when she thought she was closing a hostile deal. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the envelope. I didn't even look angry. I slowly reached out, took the cream envelope, and placed it inside the inner pocket of my blazer. I see, I said softly. I'm glad you're being reasonable, Julian said, letting out a short, relieved breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as he leaned back. We can have the lawyers finalize the signatures on Friday morning at 10 at the corporate office. There won't be any need for a Friday meeting, I said, picking up my cane and standing up with deliberate, smooth grace. I adjusted my blazer, looking down at my mother, whose smile had suddenly frozen at my refusal to look defeated. Thank you for the dinner invitation, Mother. Enjoy the Sancerre. It's likely the last vintage you'll be able to afford from this cellar. Before either of them could reply, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, the steady, rhythmic click-clack of my cane echoing against the quiet dining room like the ticking of a countdown clock. The next morning, at precisely 9 a.m., I sat in the grand conference room of Vance Family Holdings in downtown Richmond. I had arrived an hour early to set up. On the long mahogany table, I didn't place coffee or pastries. Instead, I laid out 3 blue leather-bound binders, each marked with a silver federal asset tag. When Vivian and Julian walked in, accompanied by their senior corporate counsel, Arthur Pendleton, a man who had handled my father's estate for 30 years, they looked annoyed to find me sitting at the head of the table, rather than waiting in the reception area. Eleanor, what is this? Julian asked, his voice losing some of its country club smoothness and rising in pitch. Our meeting wasn't scheduled until Friday, and you're sitting in my chair. Sit down, Julian, I said. The tone was no longer just calm. It was the commanding voice of an officer in a tactical operations center. It carried an absolute, unyielding authority that made Julian halt mid-stride. Arthur Pendleton looked at the binders on the table, his eyes narrowing behind his gold-rimmed spectacles. He recognized the format of formal legal exhibits. He took his seat cautiously, pulling his chair close to the table. My mother sat next to Julian, her arms crossed, her expression darkening as she realized I wasn't there to sign their papers. "Let's get this over with," Vivian said coldly. "We have the final contract ready for your signature, Eleanor. We don't have time for games. We won't be signing that contract," I began, opening the first binder. "Instead, we're going to review the structural reality of Vance Family Holdings. Julian, you and Mother believe that because Father left you the corporate shares of the holding company, you own the Vance Apiary. You assume that the land, the bees, and the commercial infrastructure are a single, unified asset. That was your first strategic error." I tapped the first document in the binder, a certified copy of the 1974 land deed. In 1974, Grandpa Silas didn't deed the land to Vance Family Holdings, I explained, sliding the document across the table toward Arthur Pendleton. He deeded the 300 acres of land to the corporation, yes. But if you turn to page 14, section 4, paragraph B, you will find a permanent, non-extinguishable agricultural easement and water right reservation. Pendleton adjusted his glasses, leaned over the document, and began to read. Within 5 seconds, the color began to drain from his face, turning a pasty, chalky white. "What does it say, Arthur?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and impatient. Pendleton swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly. It states that Silas Vance reserved the exclusive personal rights to all natural groundwater springs on the property, along with a 20-foot wide perpetual right-of-way easement encompassing every existing BR and access road on the acreage. This right was held personally by Silas to be transferred explicitly outside the corporate entity. And 3 years ago, I continued, opening the second binder. Before Grandpa Silas passed away, he executed his personal special power of appointment. He didn't leave those rights to my father. He left them to me. Here is the recorded deed transfer, filed quietly in the county registry while I was stationed overseas. I looked directly at Julian. To put it in terms a luxury wellness brand would understand, Julian, your corporation owns the dirt. But I own the water, and I own every road that leads to the hives. As of 6 a.m. this morning, I have filed a formal injunction with the State Agricultural Board. I am shutting off the water access to the commercial bottling facility on the property, and I am closing the private access roads to all corporate vehicles. "You can't do that," Julian shouted, half rising from his chair, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. "That paralyzes the entire operation. We have trucks arriving next week for the summer harvest prep. The contracts are already signed. I can do that, and I have done it," I replied, my voice dropping into an ice-cold whisper. As a logistics officer, I specialize in cutting off supply lines. Without water, your bottling facility cannot meet OSHA sterilization standards. Without road access, your employees cannot legally drive to the hives without committing criminal trespass. Your trucks will be idling at the main highway gate, turning around at their own expense. "Arthur, fix this," my mother snapped, her composure finally cracking, her hand tightening around her designer handbag until her knuckles turned white. "Tell her this isn't legal. She's extorting us." Pendleton didn't look up from the paperwork. His hand was shaking as he turned the page. It's perfectly legal, Vivian. The easement is ironclad. It runs with the land. It cannot be dissolved by a corporate majority vote. She has total control over the infrastructure. We can't even access the storage sheds without her permission. But that's just the logistics, I said, opening the third and final binder. This one contained a single gold-sealed certificate from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, alongside a DNA sequencing report from the Department of Agriculture. "Let's talk about the biological assets," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. The Vance Apiary's entire value lies in our proprietary lineage of Italian honeybees, the Apis mellifera Silas strain. They are highly resistant to foul brood disease and produce an exceptionally high enzyme honey. Julian, you thought that strain belonged to the company because it was on the property. I slid the USPTO certificate across the polished wood. It came to stop right in front of my brother's trembling hands. Grandpa Silas patented the genetic line and registered the biological trademark under his personal agricultural laboratory in 1992. In his will, he left that laboratory and all its intellectual property, including the Live Queen genetic registry, exclusively to me. The bees currently flying through those 300 acres are my legal property. The corporate hives they're living in are merely rented housing. You are essentially harboring my livestock without a lease agreement. The room became so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Julian looked down at the gold seal as if it were a live grenade. This morning, I said, my legal team delivered a formal cease and desist order to your New York investment partners. It informs them that Vance Family Holdings does not possess the genetic rights, the trademark authorization, or the biological license to sell or market honey derived from the Silas strain. Any contract you sign with them is fraudulent, and I will sue both them and you for patent infringement in federal court by the end of the business day. Julian sank back into his chair, the air completely leaving his lungs. His eyes went wide, staring at me as if he were seeing a total stranger. You're destroying the company. You're wiping out everything Father built. You're ruining our family name. No, I said softly, my voice completely steady. Father didn't build this. Grandpa Silas built it. And you and Mother tried to use it as a weapon to humiliate me because I came home from a war zone with a cane instead of corporate trophy. You thought I was weak because I was broken. You forgot that a soldier knows exactly how to build a trench and wait. My mother looked at me, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and sudden, terrifying realization. The elegant, untouchable matriarch was gone. In her place sat a woman who realized her entire lifestyle. The country club memberships, the Sancerre, the New York trips, was balanced on a ledger that I now controlled. "What do you want, Eleanor?" she whispered, her voice cracking for the very first time in my life. I pulled a fresh document from my briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the table. It was a corporate buyout agreement, but the terms were entirely different from the ones they had offered me 12 hours ago. You will sign over 100% of the voting shares of Vance Family Holdings to me, I said. You and Julian will formally resign from the board, effective immediately. In return, I will grant you a modest, non-voting dividend from the secondary timber sales, enough to pay for a comfortable, quiet retirement in a small condo in Richmond. You will vacate the main estate house by the end of the month. I am taking over the apiary. I am taking over the land. And I am running it the way Silas intended. Julian looked at Arthur Pendleton, desperation in his eyes. Arthur, isn't there something we can do? A loophole? Anything? Can't we fight the injunction? Pendleton slowly closed the binder, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. He didn't look at Julian. Sign the papers, Julian. If she takes this to federal court, the litigation will bankrupt the holding company within 6 months, and you will end up with absolutely nothing. This is the only exit you have left. She has completely boxed us in. The transition was completed without a single shout, a single tear, or a single headline in the local paper. Wealthy families of our tier do not scream in public. We simply disappear behind shifting corporate structures and new signatures on recorded deeds. By the end of June, my mother and Julian had moved out of the Grand Estate House. They bought a quiet, unremarkable townhouse in a historic suburb of Richmond. It is a nice enough place, but it doesn't have a long gravel driveway. It doesn't have an orchard, and the air there smells of asphalt and car exhaust rather than cold slate and ancient oak. Julian took a job as a mid-level consultant at a firm where nobody knows his last name, and my mother no longer hosts the summer gala. I moved my belongings into the master study of the old orchard house, the room that used to belong to my father and to Silas before him. I replaced the heavy velvet drapes with simple, clear glass that lets the morning sun flood the hardwood floors. My army uniforms are hung neatly in the closet, next to my canvas beekeeping overalls. Yesterday morning, I walked down to the main bee yard. The summer harvest prep is underway, and the air was thick with the low, therapeutic hum of millions of bees returning from the clover fields, their legs heavy with golden pollen. I didn't wear a full veil. I just wore my old green military cap and a light linen shirt. I leaned my cane against the side of a white-painted hive body. My left leg still aches when the humidity drops, and the brace is a permanent part of my silhouette. But as I lifted the outer cover of a brood box and smelled the sweet, sharp scent of fresh honey and propolis, I realized something profound. The hive doesn't care about beauty. It doesn't care about social status, country club politics, or the elegance of your stride. The hive cares about resilience. It cares about capability, loyalty to the foundation, and the quiet discipline required to build something that survives the winter. My family looked at my wounds and saw an ending. They didn't realize that the military hadn't broken me. It had merely refined me. It had stripped away the need for their approval and replaced it with the tactical patience of a predator. I'm no longer shrinking to fit a seat at a table that was built on my grandfather's back. I didn't need them to give me a place. I owned the ground the table was standing on all along. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, or discards you the moment you no longer fit their pristine, convenient image of success, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. Walk away from their table, find your own foundation, and build a kingdom they can't touch. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment with your own story of boundary setting below. Hit subscribe to join our community here at Calm Drama Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.